Good morning, everybody. Looks like we got a good crowd today. How you doing? I'm John, and this is the Intertestamental series. So we are going through Between the Testaments. So it's funny because I actually was reading a book from a guy recently, and I got a couple books from him. One is it basically gives you extra information of the Old Testament, extra information of the New Testament. He was saying, the more information you have, the more you understand what you're reading. And so if you really want to understand the New Testament, you've got to understand this, because everything we go through, and I think even from last week when we went through Darius and the things Darius did and everything, helps us to understand why we are where we're at. So let's pray, and then we can get going. Father, thank you so much that you've provided us for us and helped us to see. Please help us to understand what we're hearing today. Please help us to have a desire. Please give us a desire to want to look into more, to understand your word. Thank you. We just ask this in Jesus' name. One of the things I just came to me, I was thinking yesterday, if you don't know what happened, it's kind of like going into a movie halfway through. You go into a 3-hour movie and you join about halfway through. You don't really know anything what happened in the beginning. You don't really know much, you kind of know what's going on now, not really, and you're kind of like, well, and in the end, when it's all over, you're still going to yourself, well, why did they do such and such? Because you missed the whole beginning. And that's what this is. This is the beginning. So we're going to go through, today we're going to go through the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, we're going to go into Hanukkah, we're going to go into the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Oral Torah, we're going to go through the synagogues, we're going to go through some things like that, and what led up to Hanukkah. Once we get to Hanukkah in that area, that's where we're going to stop. Next week, we're going to go into the Romans a lot. We're going to go into Herod, who was Herod, how the Romans came about, why there were Roman soldiers with Jesus. We're going to go into all of that. So, and then we're also going to go into a little bit about baptism. We're going to go into a little bit how things came about. So let's get going. All right, as you know, I always like to do church history. In the 12th century, the church began to educate the clergy. So you're like, well, why do they need to do that? Well, in a time where the clergy couldn't read or write, that kind of poses a problem when trying to teach the word. Now, granted, by this time, the church already had everything very much in kind of an order, and so it didn't take a lot to kind of take people through this. But the thing is, we found that the clergy just did not have much reading and writing experience. So what they did is they began to teach them a liberal arts degree. And actually even today, now this we know would be more like from the Catholic era, but even today, and I'll just tell you, the priests from the Catholics today come out with a doctorate degree. They actually go through a lot of training for that. But back then, this is where it started. And so from there, the schools began to branch off and teach law and medicine and stuff like that. But they were all usually, founded by the church and everything. Now, there was some good and bad things that came out of it. The good thing is that, the teacher, the preacher, the pastor, whatever you want to call them, they have a good understanding of the word, and they can actually teach it because they can read it. The bad thing is what happened with this is that, especially in the Catholic Church, the priests were the guys that came who knew everything, so we're going to leave it to them to tell us what's right and what's wrong. So the problem is that sadly what happened in the Catholic Church is that they actually kept teaching in Latin. They never gave an English Bible for probably till like the 1800s or even after that. They didn't stop their services in Latin until the 1900s. And so people did not understand what was going on. So that turned out to be a big problem. So that's one of the reasons why I find Catholics, they're like, well, what about this? You try to teach them. Well, I don't know, go ask the priest, they always tell you. So that's the reason why. So I'm throwing this at, this is just Christian history, and all I'm going to do this is to tell you that we will be teaching a Christian history class in May, and I promise you it will not be boring. We don't go through dates and times. We're going to go through things about what about the Crusades, what happened, why did people bring artifacts, like they would have to, I got a piece of the cross and I'm going to go heal everybody with it. That was like the way they thought. It was some strange stuff. But there were also really good things of how our faith came to be. I promise you, you will learn a lot and your Christianity will be enriched by this. All right. All right, let's go back to the intertestamental period. So, Alexander the Great, who was he trained by? Aristotle. What was one aspect about Aristotle that made him different? Monotheism, yes. He was like the only Greek guy that really, instead of having all the pantheon of gods, he was more monotheist. Okay, very good. So, what about, let's go back to Darius. What two things did Darius, remember Darius, the guy who married Queen Esther? What two things did Darius do to help the Persian Empire fall? What did he do? Yeah, he's like our government today. They spent money like crazy and now they ran out of it. Yes, what's the other thing he did? Has to do with the Greeks. He fought the Greeks, right? The Battle of Marathon and the Battle of Marathon, the Battle of Thermopylae, right? So he fought the Greeks. And so what was happened, the Persian Empire, that we leave the Bible, the Old Testament, we all know in the Old Testament, who was in charge? Persians, yes. At the end of the Old Testament, we know from Malachi, all those guys, Persians were in charge. But why did they fall? Because they made stupid decisions. They fought the Greeks. And the Greeks made stupid decisions. What did the Greeks do after that? Nope. Greeks fought the Romans actually about 100 years earlier than, about a little bit earlier than that. They fought each other. The big problem, we fight each other, we don't get along, and whole entire countries fall. The Greeks fell. So if the Greeks fell, who picked up the pieces? Who was the next place that picked up the piece of the Greeks? Rome. Nope. Rome wasn't come in for another 400 years. 300 years, actually. Actually, 200 years.
All these generals.
Those guys. Yes. Macedonia. Remember the Macedonians. Yes. The Macedonians. And who was the leader of the Macedonians? Philip, yes. Because that's why we see in the New Testament they name people Philip. Was because they look back to Philip the Great. Philip's son was Alexander the Great, who was trained by Aristotle. That's very important. Yeah, that will come into play today, though, by the way. That's going to come into play today. So once we see that now we got Aristotle in there, now we have this. So now we find that Alexander goes through and wipes everybody out and gets this great empire. He dies in 10 years, and that's where we're at today. Alexander the Great dies and leaves his empire to 4 generals. Now, we are not going to go over the 4 generals. We only care about 2, because those 2 guys are going to have a huge impact on what we're going to talk about and huge impact on the Jews. So, the Ptolemies were the first ones, and these guys are very, very important. So the Ptolemies, this guy right here, Ptolemy was one of his generals. He was not a really good guy. He actually treated the Jews very poorly. Now, did Alexander the Great treat the Jews good? Yeah. Yes, he did. Remember, he got off his horse and, according to Josephus, bowed down to the high priest, which is like, we're talking, this major dude did a pretty big thing to the high priest. So, and he actually gave favor to them. So Ptolemy, we know, this guy comes in and he wasn't that great. Now, these guys actually went actually into Egypt. So the Ptolemies were the Egypt, and that becomes important here in a minute. Ptolemies are the people in Egypt. So and the other guy, Seleucid, is going to be up here above. So notice this is Judah. So they're under the Ptolemaic Empire, and Seleucid's up here. please keep this in mind because this is going to be important. These guys are going to cause some major problems for Jews. All right, so all the Ptolemies from then on out took on the name of Ptolemy. So guess what? Your name is now Ptolemy blah, blah, blah. Okay? Everybody took on the name of Ptolemy. So Philadelphus is the guy that we're concerned with because what he did, instead of being nasty and mean like a lot of the other people did, he was actually favorable towards the Jews. He was nice to the Jews, and he wanted to appease them because in his area, there was a lot of Jews. Remember, the diaspora people spread out all over the place. And so he was very favorable. He actually began to dress like a pharaoh within his time. So immediately they started dressing pharaoh. They started going that direction. And Philadelphus, he was a decent guy, kind of took on the role. Hey, I'm Mr. Pharaoh. So, one of the things that Philadelphus did was produce this. Now, he didn't do it, but he had 70 Jews, 70 leaders come together for the Septuagint. Now, this is major, because this is the Greek version of the Old Testament. Now, everything we read Greek version of the New Testament, everything we read in the Old Testament, everything we read in the New Testament was all in Greek. We saw that last week. Remember, what were the Greeks called? Hellenists. And we even looked in 2 different passages of the Bible that the Bible even calls them Hellenes, because it's all Greek. And so I'm going to tell you that this Greek Bible would be used for the next 600 years. Even into the early Christian church, this is what they used before they translated it to Latin. So the Septuagint is huge because the problem was that the Jews just couldn't read Hebrew anymore because once Ptolemy came in there and everybody was starting getting born, and they started speaking Greek. So they wanted to get it translated. That's where it came from. So basically, the Latin Bible would not come till 380 AD, where a guy named Jerome is going to write that. But Greek was going to be the second language of the empire, even into the Romans. Does anybody know what language the Romans spoke? Starts with an L. Latin, yes. They spoke Latin. So but yet your Jews all spoke Greek for the most part. Only like directly in Judah does people still really speak Hebrew for the most part. Now, remember, Paul was born in Turkey, but he was trained in Jerusalem. So Paul spoke Greek and Hebrew. Okay? But whatever he wrote everything in Greek. Very important. Now, also, a lot of our books in the Old Testament that we call them are actually named because of the Greek. For instance, the book of Deuteronomy is Greek. Mesopotamia, we talked about, is Greek. We talk about the area of Judah was called the Levant. That's Greek. A lot of, even today, the things we have are called Greek. Also, there was a major city in Egypt that still exists today called Alexandria. Wonder where you got that name from. All right. So other things that Philadelphus did. Well, according to Jerome, Philadelphus, kind of like the Jews, he built a synagogue with that sits as many as 10,000 people. This is per Jerome. Now granted, he might be exaggerating, but still, the key is that he built a synagogue that sat 10,000 people. Also, what he did is he really helped them to build more stuff around. This is around Alexandria in Egypt. They also built a temple down there. Was that lawful? Were they supposed to build a temple outside of Judah? No, but they did. Now, we're going to get a little bit into that today, why that happened and some of the things about that. So no, they weren't supposed to, according to the law, there was only supposed to be one place they're supposed to build one. All right, so, but what he did is he really did this to make them happy. Now, also there was a library in Alexandria, some other things in Alexandria. There's a lot of things going on. But so basically the Ptolemies were really good to the Jews. The Seleucids, we're going to find out here in a little bit, were not. All right, let's take another look at Alexandria. I just like to throw this in. Alexandria was one of the greatest places for Christianity. It was a major center of Christianity. A lot of our guys, Athanasius, my guy Athanasius, you've probably heard me talking about him. He was called the Black Dwarf. He was a short black guy, and he was one of the great. Now, Athanasius was so big that when Constantine called the first council in Nicaea of 120 of the bishops from around the world, Athanasius is what pretty much headed the whole thing. He was a big guy, and he is one of the greatest church fathers. I always said what we need to do is have trading cards. Forget the stupid sports figures who beat their wives, who drunk drive, everything else. Let's put these guys on there, Athanasius on there, Clement, or Jerome, or whatever. We get these guys, and let me tell you, that would be awesome. Have a bunch of trading cards for those guys. All right. So Clement was there. He was an apologist during the 2nd century. Origen, who actually was trained by Clement, and he was one of the greatest Christian apologists, came from Alexandria. So we've got to remember that black and white, everybody mixed very freely then. There was no issues. We did not have a problem with them and us and everything else. Everybody got along for the most part. So there was also a major library that was one of these 7 wonders of the world in Alexandria. That's big. It was huge, and that got destroyed, unfortunately. And so the thing is, everything was lost, though, when the Muslims took the offensive. So I'm not here to bash the Muslims, but the Muslims came in and pretty much took over all of North Africa and all of the Middle East. They pretty much took all of that out. And so one of the things we find that the mixing of people pretty much kind of stopped because everybody from the African region, the Middle East and everything kind of stayed there and they were Muslim, and everybody from Europe became Christian. All right. Now, one of the things I also say, but what they also destroyed the library in Alexandria. It wasn't the first time it was destroyed. There was actually 3 or 4 fires that burned it. But what they did is that they actually were taking the books and use it for the furnace under the city to heat the baths. So, I don't know. Too bad. That was supposed to be a cool place. All right. Now, let's talk about something a little different here. The cult of Osiris. Now, Ptolemy was a good guy, to the Jews and everything. He just was a little off. So the cult of Osiris, and there's a lot of aspects to this cult, but the thing about what he did was, the big thing about the cult of Osiris was that they were to marry their sisters. Seriously. So a lot of your pharaohs married the sisters, and they felt that it was more important to do that because guaranteed if you keep in the family, they're not going to attack and try to take you over. So you marry your sister, guaranteed she's going to support you. I'm just saying, that's what they thought. Now, that's them. Okay, so many of your pharaohs would do this. And so, yeah, Ptolemy kind of got into that. I mean, even from the very beginning. All right, dude, you're a little off there, but hey. All right, the Jews would remain peaceful until 190 BC. So for about 100 years, Jews had relative peace in the land. Now, in 190 BC, they had a little problem. The Seleucids started wanting to come in and say, hey, you know what? I want the Ptolemies' land. The Ptolemies like, I like the Seleucid land. Gee, why don't we do what everybody else in the world does? Let's have a war. We don't like each other. We're going to have a war with each other. Hey, why not? I want yours. You want mine? Hey. So they had a war. Now, the problem is that the thing about the Seleucid, unlike the Ptolemies, did not look favorably on the Jews. Now, one of the reasons why is because the Jews supported the Ptolemies. I mean, I would too, man. You build me a 10,000 person synagogue and everything else, I'd be happy with you. So the Seleucid basically said, we don't like that. Now, so what they wanted to do is they wanted to spread Hellenism. What was Hellenism again? Greek ideas.
Yeah.
All the Greek ideas. Now, again, we saw last week that the Greek ideas, even today, are even in our government. We do Greek ideas. Our government actually have the Senate, the way they do things, the way we do things in politics, even in front of our White House. The polls of the White House are Greek. Very important. There's a lot of stuff going on. So basically, one of the things that happened though, when Seleucid did come in and say, we're going to bring Greek ideas to you, all of a sudden all the Jews said, nope, we're not going to do that. No, that's not what happened. So what happened was 40 to 50% of the Jews actually said, oh, we're going to do that. And it's a very similar thing as just what happens today. Remember, today is not any worse than any other day. Okay, everything's the same. Solomon says, everything is the same. Just to repeat, when the alternative lifestyle came into the church here, how many Christians jumped on the bandwagon and said, woohoo, let's do it? A lot. So the reality is back then, 50% of the Jews, they kind of started saying, yeah, we like this, let's start doing it. Okay? So, let's look at some aspects. Before we go into that, let's talk about this, because this is going to become important. So let's take just a quick minute and go towards the oral Torah. Now, there was two types of Torah. Now, you've probably never heard of this. And I'll tell you, I was a little surprised too until I started looking into it. But the oral Torah, the original Torah is actually from the Pentateuch. What is the Pentateuch? First 5 books of Moses. So the written Torah is considered the first 5 books. Everything after that, the prophets, the wisdom books, like Psalms, Proverbs, those guys, the historical books like Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, all of that stuff was considered oral Torah. Someone actually did write it down, but it kind of kept it separate. But one thing we've got to understand about the Jews is that they continue to write even though Malachi was gone. So everything didn't stop at Malachi and start with Jesus. There was a lot of stuff said. Think of the oral Torah as this. In Christianity, is the word Trinity used in the Bible? No. We actually it's part of a Christian tradition. We know that to believe in the Trinity because the Bible is very specific. We use that word. So we basically put that in there. It's not that we're adding it, is that the Bible specifically talks about it. We just use it as a word to describe something. That's kind of like the oral Torah. That's what they did. When things happen, they try to describe things. So as the church went along, there were other aspects of the church of how things this way or that way we see things changing. That's what the oral Torah was. The oral Torah was basically the prophets, the wisdom books, and the writings of the rabbis or the Pharisees and Sadducees from that point. Okay? So they actually got together with the oral Torah. They actually got together and wrote everything down. Okay? But so beyond centuries. All right, they actually got together and wrote everything down in these books. So after the Jews were kicked out of Jerusalem, yes, that's part of Christian history. The Jews were actually booted out of Jerusalem, out of Judah. They started writing all this stuff down, and they started writing. And that one of the things you may have heard of the thing called the Talmud. And the Talmud and the Mishnah is actually part of the oral Torah. All their oral and teachings and everything else, they wrote it all down, and that's what they use. So basically, it's kind of like the Jewish Bible today. Okay, so they kind of compiled everything and put things together. So the thing is, that's what the Jews use today. Now, how does this affect Christianity? Well, when you're dealing with things in Christianity, you see that Jesus confronts many different problems. He confronts the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and some of the things he was confronting, you say, well, you scratch your head and said, that really wasn't in the Old Testament, but it was the oral Torah. So a lot of the things we find that they started doing and making decisions and different changes was all part of the oral Torah. Okay? And Jesus was saying, hey, this is not right. You're doing this, you're doing that. And if you notice, if you ever read a lot of the things when he confronts these guys, there was always a money something to do with money in there also. Very big thing about money. So, because they liked being rich. But the thing is, that was all the oral Torah. So when Jesus confronts them, the Jews were dealing with this. And that's what Jesus was confronting, was this. So if you understand the way the oral Torah goes, you'll understand. Now, there are going to be two sets of people that are going to have a problem with this, and we're going to talk about that here in a few minutes. All right. The next thing we need to deal with is the Apocrypha. Now, the Apocrypha, that's Greek. It's not Hebrew. So what this is, the Apocrypha, if you come from a Catholic background or whatever, you remember the Apocrypha was part of the Bible. The Apocrypha actually was part of the Bible, even in the King James Version, up until about 1750, where they finally got rid of it. But the Apocrypha was the writings of the intertestamental period. Okay? That was all the writings that when they wrote a bunch of stuff down, the writings was that. Now, to think about it, if you assume that everything ends with Malachi and begins back with Jesus, it's kind of like saying that nobody wrote anything in America for 400 years. Because, of course, that's not true. We wrote a lot of stuff in America, and this is what they wrote. This is some of the stuff they wrote. Some of this stuff got put into the Scripture. Now, there was some good and bad things about it. So basically, the Apocrypha comes from the Greek meaning hidden. So they call it hidden knowledge. Not really. Don't think too Gnostically about the Gnostics, because it's not necessarily hidden knowledge. But basically, it's these kind of separate knowledge and interesting knowledge. So the people kind of, and I like what this says here, that its body esoteric writings first were prized, then were tolerated, and finally excluded. So as the church went on, they're kind of like, this stuff has some problems. And it has a lot of problems. I kind of like what the NIV talks about, says, the NIV kind of talks about, and when they describe the Apocrypha, in the kinder, gentler way, saying, nothing in the Apocrypha really is nothing new compared to what you have in the Bible. So don't read the Apocrypha. Anything you're going to read here is what you're going to find in the Bible. Now, I don't really agree with that completely, because I believe in the second way of thinking of things. The Apocrypha, and we're going to go through those books here in just a minute. It's interesting information, and actually we're going to read from some of the Apocrypha just today, just a little bit in Maccabees, just to give you guys a flavor of what went on. But it's interesting, but don't use it for enlightenment. Basically, it's not the Word of God. Okay? There were a lot of problems with the Apocrypha. There was a lot of really bad history in it, incorrect dates, incorrect times, who they say that was writing it. We find that a lot of the stuff really is not true. But remember last week we talked about when they took the Apocrypha out of the Bible, what happened? What happened? Where did people's ideas go? Pardon me?
With the Apocrypha.
Well, it did, but the thing is, remember the Apocrypha, what the Apocrypha did was basically teach us about the intertestamental period. There's some good history in it. There's some decent things in it, but the problem is once they took it away because there are some other problems in it, we stopped thinking of the intertestamental period. We don't think about it anymore, because once the Apocrypha left, those ideas kind of left too. And so it was good because it gives us information of the intertestamental period. It's bad because there's a lot of really, really bad stuff in it. So here's the Apocrypha, who accept what. Now, the Catholic Church and stuff still have this, and a lot of the Greek Orthodox, those guys still have this. Now, I'm going to tell you, this, I don't know why they still have it. Because, for instance, Tobit is a story that's not real, it's completely false. It's just a story. Now, some of these guys like Judith and Tobit, those books, just to give you a little information, those books would be great as short stories, short fiction stories. They're really good fiction. They're actually interesting fiction. But as long as you see them as fiction, it's okay. But once you start saying, well, that's what God did, that's the problem. It's not there. Editions of Esther. People added. Now, the editions of Esther is interesting because, remember in Esther, what is one thing that's never spoken in Esther? God, right. In the editions of Esther, it's spoken over 40 times. So it's like all of a sudden it's like you get this, but you're like this, all of a sudden, woof, you get to like the couple chapters of Esther, it's all over the place. Sirach, Baruch. Baruch's not a bad one, and actually I've seen in the Catholic Church they actually still read a little bit from Baruch. Letter of Jeremiah was not written by Jeremiah or his scribe. Bel and the Dragon is actually about Daniel. And the first and second Maccabees. So the problem with a lot of these guys is a lot of church problems happen with this. Number one, problems about praying for the dead comes from the Maccabees. Pray for the dead. And that's what it says. There's a verse in Maccabees about praying for the dead. We don't pray for the dead. Okay? We don't, you can't, and also there's a thing in Maccabees about redeeming the dead, paying to get them back. You can't pay to get people back. So, again, yes, sir?
There weren't strong references to purgatory.
There weren't strong references. There was actually a couple verses that kind of mention that kind of a little bit here and there about purgatory, and they kind of took it. The problem was, again, with these books, if you look at these books, if you go by what these books say alone, and you can make whatever doctrine you want out of them. If you don't match them, just a second, if you don't match them with the Bible and say, what does the Bible say, that's the problem. Yes, sir?
The timeline on this, because I'm hearing you say, I don't want to get a misinformation or misunderstanding, so I want to make sure I understand it clearly. So the Apocrypha shows up in the King James Bible, but it's not like it had been in common usage. Like the canon, the inspired canon is closed, what, 4th century, 5th century?
It was never completely closed. But here's the
Mostly agreed on. The Apocrypha doesn't get added in until like the Counter-Reformation. So it's 1,000 years before it officially is added.
Not really. Actually, the Apocrypha was actually added way earlier than that in a lot of texts. Now, here's the thing. In the early church, the Apocrypha was, some people said yay, other people said nay, and they didn't do it. But it actually was in...
But you don't see it on the lists in the councils that they're
right.
decided on the canon of Scripture. Those Apocryphal books are not ever in those lists.
Because the thing is, what they said, the whole idea was, it was what the Catholics actually use. I'm trying to remember the wording that they used. What they like to use is, it's okay to read in your closet in the study as a secret thing. That's why they call it Apocrypha, as a secret thing. But it's not something to dedicate everything to. But the sad part is they still, some of the different teachings of the Middle Ages that we see, from praying from the dead, praying for the saints, going to saints instead of God, going to different, we see from that. And it was all, for centuries, it really was at the end of most of that. But we got to remember, who actually was able to read the Scriptures prior to even Calendar Reformation 1537 and Council? That's one of the big problem was. So that was one of the big problems, because prior to the printing press in 1648, I think it was 1448, prior to that, people just didn't have books. So only the priests had them, and so they had the exclusive knowledge, quote unquote. And so that's one of the reasons why it was like 1750. It was actually added to the King James Version, but the Protestants got rid of it because they're saying, this just doesn't add up. And so, thank you. No, that's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up because, the problem is this was added stuff, but it's not really. Do you really? Yeah, it's one of those, because like I said, even the Catholics said it's something to read in your closet by yourself, not something to read out loud. But I'm going to tell you, they read it out loud because I actually been in Catholic services where they read from Baruch. So Baruch, I think it's Baruch. But anyway, so they still do some of that, and they still have it. But my question is, why do they still have it, even though we've... And what's interesting about the Counter-Reformation, the Counter-Reformation was basically that which comes after Martin Luther. Martin Luther in 1519 in the Council of Worms, basically that he argued the Bible. The Catholics argued the traditions of the church. And he lost because it was about the Catholics said, well, it's all about the traditions of the church. And the traditions of the church had a lot of this junk in it. Again, it's kind of like the oral Torah. The traditions of the church is like the oral Torah. Well, it's the things we believe over here, but it's not found in here. So we're going to get more into this when we get to that. So when we get into Christian history, we're definitely going to be dealing with this guy because I think it's very important that we do have a little bit better understanding of the Apocrypha than we do. But we'll talk about that. Is there any other questions? Yes, sir.
An observation, that's kind of where the Mishnah comes in as an intertestamental writing of like with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And that's where a lot of the things that Jesus had to address came up because the Pharisees especially were like very legalistic. They were spiritual policemen.
Yes.
They had good intentions, but their intentions took them beyond what God stated. And it's like, okay, here's the line. We're going to make rules
and
5 steps back.
Beyond what God stated.
Right.
That's the key. Beyond what God stated. They took this, that's where the traditions comes in, that's where this comes in, and you're exactly right. It's beyond. Once we start going beyond, you got to question it a little bit. Any other questions? Good job, Paul. Thank you.
Well, and of course, Jesus never quoted anything.
Not whatsoever. Not whatsoever. Now, even Hanukkah's not even mentioned in the Bible. But Hanukkah was a good thing. But yeah, even that wasn't so. All right, let's talk about those two guys, Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, we got to go into these guys before we move on. So, the Sadducees. Who are the Sadducees? Now, the Sadducees were really the leaders. They were priests. Okay, now, there were some Pharisees that were priests too. But these guys, the general populace just really did not like these guys. They didn't like these guys. And the thing is, the problem, and this is even per Josephus, the problem with the Sadducees was the fact that they actually were kind of swayed by, Greek ideas. Because they didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. When you're dead, you're dead. That's it. They didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. They didn't believe in the return. They didn't believe in any of that because the reason is because all their belief system focuses only on the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. So that was very specifically only the law. So which means the prophets, they didn't believe in. We believe in the prophets. It's all in the Bible. The wisdom books, Solomon, Song of Solomon, Proverbs, Psalms, they didn't believe in that. Okay? They didn't believe in the historical books. So wherever we see, they didn't believe in any of that stuff. They were often very rich and powerful. Again, when you read through Jesus, look at some of the ways he talked to those guys. A lot of stuff was about money back then. They didn't believe oral. And the thing about the Sadducees, though, that we see them leaving history after the fall of the temple. The fall of the temple is when we don't see them anymore. Pharisees on the other side were some priests, and they were scribes. These were the guys who wrote down the books. Now, we know that Ezra, Nehemiah, all the prophets, they were already written down. So when we call them, it's kind of oral Torah is a little weird because they were written down. But they're considered oral Torah. So the Pharisees believed in the oh crap, I'm going too far. So, oh my gosh. So the Pharisees believed in the oral Torah. Now, Before, let's go and let's test your knowledge. Luke 4:16-17. He went up to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue. He picks up the scroll of Isaiah. Who handed him the scroll of Isaiah? Sadducees or Pharisees? Pharisees. Why?
They only believed in it. They believed in it.
Yeah, the Sadducees wouldn't teach from Isaiah. So it had to be the Pharisees because they didn't believe in Isaiah. When Jesus was taken before the high priest, was he a Pharisee or Sadducee?
No, Sadducee.
He was a Sadducee because he was a leader.
Right.
They were the leaders. So the high priests were always Sadducees. See where this information becomes important? Because now you know who you're talking to, and you know a little bit. And by the way, I don't know your name, but you're taking notes. I will get you a copy of the PowerPoint if you want.
Hey, that would be great.
We can help you with that. All right, synagogue. The synagogue was created during the Babylonian exile, okay? Because they had no temple. So they had to have a place that people come together and worship and everything. So the synagogue basically was that, and it was a place to meet. Now, the synagogue will continue until today. And by the way, the Sadducees did not go to the synagogue. Remember, they only taught in the temple because that was from the law. Synagogue was oral Torah. See? All right, so we got a few more minutes. I know, give me just a few minutes. Over 100 years, the Jews lived in relative peace. Okay, that's important. They lived in peace. So, in 190, everything's going to change forever. The Seleucid kingdom basically came in and said, we're going to take control and you're going to be Greeks, whether you like it or not. You know, kind of like what our government does today. You're going to be what we want you to be, and if not, we'll teach you that way. So, forced Hellenization. There's two reasons why they did this. Number one, because they supported the Ptolemaic Empire. They were favorable for Jews. And the second reason is they believe, and this is going to be important, that the pagan philosophy, if you make the gods happy, they will give you benefits in battle. Rome is going to adopt this philosophy. Keep the gods happy. If you don't keep them happy, they're not going to be happy with you. If Judah's not serving the gods, not serving Zeus and all those guys, then Zeus is going to come against the Seleucids. Seriously. So to them, there was a big religious reason why they came after him. So let's get you into Greeks. Let's get you to worship Zeus. And one of the things that they did was set up Zeus in the temple. Guess what? Your temple's now going to have... Okay, one more slide. Because the problem is we got so much to do next week and I only got one more day to get it done. So one more slide. So for 30 years, from about 190 to 130, they began a Hellenization policy. They built gymnasiums, and men were supposed to go around in the nude. You can figure out what else happened after that, because that was very prevalent in this time frame, homosexuality. This was not good. Not only that, they reversed circumcision. Now, I'm going to tell you, circumcision, they're taking the foreskin off the penis, okay? How do you reverse that? That must have been very, very uncomfortable. So, literally, the Jews, because, first what they say, and we're going to read this, so since we're going to go into this next week, we're going to read in the Maccabees, they would hang the babies up by their necks and kill them if they were circumcised. They would the Seleucids were evil. They would hang the babies up, the mothers up, the babies up, so basically you can't circumcise no more. And the Jews who wanted to become the enlightened Greeks, they said, no, we're going to get this reversed. And because when they went to the gymnasium, they wanted to make sure that they looked like everybody else. Sounds familiar? So what we go through today, guys, is no different than what they did. The way they destroy themselves and destroy the bodies and everything, it's no different than back then. So we're going to end up with that. So we've got a little bit of work to do next week. And oh gosh, now I want to beg for one more day because we go through this because we got a lot to go through next week. So any questions about this? All right. Guys, thank you so much. Please come with more questions next week. We're going to go through a little bit of Maccabees next week. So.
Can I get that from you next week?